Okay, we begin. So you're very welcome to the first tutorial day, and today we're going to be looking at the assignments and the essays. And I'm going to talk a little bit about writing essays. I've put some information, as you ought to have seen, on the meeting room on essay writing. 3 different short pieces on how to write philosophical essays, and some stuff in there about writing exams as well. But for the present we'll focus on writing of essays. And there's quite a bit to get through, and of course there'll be a tutorial after. So I'll try to keep it to a time. Right, one important thing about writing essays is to keep the question in mind. So always keep the question as asked in your mind, and to answer the question as asked. And that, you could take that in a very narrow sense, but really it means that everything you say, everything you write, ought to address the question that's asked. It ought to contribute to giving an answer. If you answer a different question, or you don't focus tightly enough on what you're asked, you simply can't get the marks. The exercise is to answer the question asked. If you're asked about themes in Plato's Republic, then giving an account of Plato's life or his influence or something that isn't to do with Plato's Republic, no matter how good the essay, you simply can't be given the marks. Some of you will be quite new to academic essay writing. Some of you will not be new to it at all. You'll have some experience, and indeed some may even have experience in writing philosophical essays. But all of this is still worth keeping in mind, even if you're not new to academic writing. It's always possible to sort of improve one's writing anyway. So there's no need to be overly narrow in answering the question, but as I said, everything should address the question that's asked. The other thing is that the word limit is there's 2,000 words, 10% either way, so 200 words either side of 2,000 words. And again, that's there as an exercise. If you write an essay that's too short, there's nothing inherently wrong with it, but of course it means that you haven't used up the words that you could have. With more time you can be more subtle and say more things. At the same time, if you write over the allowed limit, much over the allowed limit, then you can't be marked on that, because if someone were to present a 4,000 word essay, the chances are it'll have more content. We can't judge it on the content, given that it also has to be fair. So how it used to be done in London, rather cruelly, is that after 2,500 words, or whatever the limit was, they'd simply stop reading. You'd be graded on how much you've done up to then, which is quite harsh. But again, there has to be sort of what do you call it? Fairness, or kind of even-handedness. Another thing with writing essays is don't write it all at one sitting. The temptation, of course, the tendency is to do too much reading and to sort of rush and do lots and lots of reading, in the thought that we need a massive amount of information to write 2,000 words. Which, again, 2,000 words can seem daunting. Again, it's think of it as 10 times 200 words. It's not an enormous amount, and you'll see that you can use your words up quite quickly, though it can be difficult to get writing, particularly in philosophy, because it's such an abstract subject. But again, you have lots of reading materials to draw upon and to construct your essay. So plan your essay, take notes on the material. Again, you don't need to take very detailed notes. It's best not to be over detailed. Make a note of what your source is, always. But you can say, in some of these books, I might have taken about 20 pages of A4 notes for an entire book, because you're looking for quite general notes. But there's no need to become an expert overnight in doing this. What you need to become is someone who's competent enough to show that you understand the topic you're being asked about. And a good way of presenting your material, the best way, is through structure. Structure is important for the coherence of your answer, and indeed coherence itself of a philosophical answer comes through the structure of the essay. The essay needs to have an introduction and a conclusion. It's a good idea at the beginning to write an introduction, by all means, to give yourself a sort of an orientation and to get used to writing too. And an introduction to what you're going to write. Clearly, your best place to write an introduction after you've finished the essay, finish the complete essay and finish the conclusion, then go back and rewrite the introduction, because now you can give a proper introduction as to what you're going to discuss and something about what you're going to say about it, what the topic is, and what the content of your conclusion will be. So there's at the end of it as well, you need a conclusion, and the conclusion's where you sort of wrap up. You give a kind of a general account of what you've said and bring it to a type of unity, to a type of cohesion and kind of rounding out of the topic. There's an old journalist adage that in writing a good journalist article, you tell them what you're going to say, then you say it, and then you tell them what you've said, and it's, something like this is going on, not quite so frivolous, but that's kind of what's going on when you have a coherent answer. So longish paragraphs should each have a topic to themselves, or some sort of unitary subject, and the essay will be split up into paragraphs, each under its own theme or its own topic. Avoid having one-line paragraphs, separated lines. Either it should go into a paragraph, or it may be just too brief and insignificant to mention. Avoid 1 or 2 line paragraphs. It breaks up the structure, and it sort of shows that there's a lack of structure, which is perhaps something you should revisit. As I said, rewriting the essay is important. Don't write it at one sitting. Don't write it the night before. Very often people say, if only I had an extra day, it would be a better essay. It means you needed to start writing earlier. And then again, I've given quite a bit of reading material, and there's more. I'll put up another article on Socrates, on Socratic dialogue and Socratic method, really, and the philosophical method of Socrates. And so there's plenty of material, but you don't need to become an expert. Again, you need to write 2,000 words, and your sort of audience is not an absolute beginner in philosophy. Perhaps it's nor is it an expert. It's as if you're explaining to an intelligent, a friend of yours. If they ask you a question, so what is Socrates' method? And you explain it to them. What is the Republic about? You explain it to them. It's that type of thing. So, and when it comes to introductions, there's a thing. It's mentioned in some of the texts I've given you about essay writing, to avoid long, rambling and sort of pointless philosophical, or sort of non-philosophical waffle or kind of jargon to begin with of Plato was a great philosopher, and people have studied his works, and they'll study his works forever, and these questions have been asked since the beginning of time, and they're still being asked and will be asked forever. This type of contentless stuff, avoid it, because you want to use your words wisely. One reason when you're taking notes or when you're writing the essay to keep track of your sources is to avoid plagiarism. There's a lengthy part, and there are notes as well, which I think I'll attach to this lecture. The Priory's own notes on writing assignments. There you'll find information on bibliography. That's a list of books or articles that you've used in the essay, and references and footnotes. And that's anything you've referred to, anything you've used, and particularly anything you've quoted. I say particularly, but it's not really particularly. If you have quoted something, you need to put it in inverted commas and give the reference. If you've referred to something or paraphrased something, and you need to give a reference to your source. And the reference includes, as it's seen in, do really read this stuff, you need to have the right form of references. I'll have a link to the Priory's own recommendations and the on guidelines on writing assignments. And this is linked in a way also to plagiarism, which is copying of material without giving the source. Plagiarism is incredibly serious as an academic offence, even if it's done inadvertently. If it's done on purpose, so much the worse. Obviously, you shouldn't plagiarise essays. If you are tempted, if it's very difficult for you to write an essay, write it anyway. Do not plagiarise. As easy as it is for you to go and Google stuff on an essay, it is as easy for a professional philosopher to find out the sources you've used. So things not to do when you're writing an essay: don't use Wikipedia. It's terrible, and it's not a source that's kind of acceptable in philosophical essays or in academic essays. Don't simply Google the answer and find a website and draw information from there. There's plenty of material in the reading lists. Don't use amateur websites about philosophy. Some of them are well-meaning, some of them are not terrible, but the problem is they're unreliable, so you simply don't know. Unless you're fairly well versed in philosophy, you can't tell if it's reliable or not. And again, if you're fairly well versed in philosophy, you won't be using sources like that anyway. So don't use amateur sources, don't use Wikipedia, and don't simply Google a bunch of websites and piece together an essay. That's plagiarism. And you need to give your sources. So there's a way of giving sources, of doing references. Look at that, study it, print it out, and use it all the time, because if you don't have proper bibliography or proper references, your marks will be, of course, docked in future years. Your essays might not be accepted. There's 3 pages there on what you need to do in giving a reference. If you have a reference to an article in a journal or something, then you need to give the author, the date, and the name of the article in inverted commas. That's a journal article. And then the page numbers and the like. And if you're referring to a book, you give the author, the year of publication, and the name of the book in italics, and the publisher, and the place of publication. It's all in the notes. Get used to it. It takes about 3 or 4 minutes to learn, and it will do you for the rest of your academic career if you're not familiar with it. So another thing that's important, as well as, it's centrally important to reference and to give quotations and quotation marks, inverted commas, and to give references throughout. Another thing in general in writing academic essays is, of course, clarity. Clarity in writing is something that's really supremely important in philosophy, because lack of clarity means very often vagueness or ambiguity. And when you're trying to persuade someone of a subtle argument or describe a philosopher's philosophy, then lack of subtlety, of course, and lack of clarity is somehow really quite fatal, I'd say. So avoid overly complex sentences, avoid too much in the way of parenthesis of qualifying phrases like "it might seem" or "it may be claimed." You get some of this stuff in some writing, not particularly in academic writing, but it just jumbles things up. It makes it unclear. It's not that people said you should use big words. There's plenty place for subtle words and for a large vocabulary. don't use them unnecessarily, and don't create sentences that are difficult to read. Some current philosophers really should take a lesson from writers like Bertrand Russell, or even more so philosophers from the Middle Ages, where their writing is really very subtle and very clear. Russell was very, very difficult as a philosopher to understand, but he's never unclear. Clarity is really an important thing to avoid unnecessary complexity in an already complex subject. So one thing that happens when students write an essay, indeed, when anyone writes something in a hurry, or he writes it too close to the deadline, is very often in trying to finish off the essay and throwing things into the conclusion, they'll have one really interesting sentence in the conclusion that's just mentioned once and forgotten, and perhaps another incredibly interesting point in the conclusion that's forgotten, which, had they more time, it would have been wise for them to take that sentence, either expand upon it or perhaps integrate it into an earlier paragraph, or perhaps make it into an entire paragraph, because it's such a good point. And it's sometimes disappointing to see a relatively competent essay that at the very end you have all of this kind of insightful material, very often drawn in from having thought about something for a long time and then panicking that you need to write something, but you end up with some kind of seriously interesting stuff. So it's a reason to at least definitely write a first draft and rewrite it and rejig it. Things like generally dodgy sources are to be avoided. As I said, Wikipedia, amateur philosophy, in general, YouTube, even sometimes professional philosophers say things that are perhaps because they're simply not peer reviewed. They say things that are indefensible in the long term, and even when they're in their own work, sometimes very good when they do podcasts or stuff on YouTube and the like. It's not always gold. One thing about the finished essay, I will say that use a font or a font of the letters that's easily legible, and that means using something like Times New Roman or something with a serif. You can see this type of I can get it in focus there. This type of stuff there, where the letters have little serifs on them. That makes it a lot easier to read. I did get an essay one year in what's called Comic Sans, which is it's used a comic book font, and I tested it. It took me double the time to read a single page compared to Times New Roman. So use Times New Roman or some serifed font, 1.5 spacing for ease of reading again, and 12 point is the size of the letter. So it's not too small, not too clunky, and it's just easier if all of them are the same. But so again, Times New Roman. If you don't have Times New Roman on your word processor, then something with a serif, not sans serif. It was a dreadful 20th century innovation from the continent, and it is more difficult to read. Words don't have a definite or as clear shape anymore. So a serif font, 1.5 line spacing, and a 12 points size. And this will make it just far quicker to read, far easier, and in the long term, when you're getting your material read over several years by lots of different academics and in later years by externals and the like, it's not a good idea to present it in a way that's difficult to read or that's just an irritation. It will add an extra layer of unnecessary prejudice. Another thing is things to avoid in academic essays. Of course, pictures, anything that you might find in a magazine, bullet points, any of this stuff. Everything should be done in proper sentences, with proper grammar, and that is sort of kind of a minimum for philosophical writing. So Yes, and again, you should read the short pieces on. They won't take you very long if you haven't read them yet. On how to write philosophical essays, it will save you time in the long run. Right, so we'll move on to the topics, and the first topic is really about whether essay, given that whether philosophy, given that it doesn't make the kind of scientific progress, or this type of cumulative progress that science makes, whether it's still worthwhile to do. And I'm not going to dwell too long on that in this lecture, simply because much of the material for this has I've done in the first two lectures, so in probably quite a bit of detail compared to the rest. So, so we can see in science there's clear progress, and in philosophy it's more difficult to see what this progress could be. There are definite accounts of reality that science gives us. That simply you can, as they say, you can take it to the bank. No one doubts these things. Of course, Bertrand Russell used to talk about progress in science and say that no one will ever doubt that the world is in motion around the sun, and that the sun is the centre of the solar system. And of course, Russell was much too optimistic in this. Of course, there's a sizable group of crazy people in America now who believe that the Earth is stationary and that there's massive sun is in orbit around the Earth. Turns out that all of the physics from Stephen Hawking, Einstein, back to Newton, Galileo, Kepler, all of this is false, and something mysterious is going on. So never underestimate the human capacity for digging back into primitive thinking. But in general, we can take it that philosophy or science definitely makes progress. You don't have to focus too much on science or the like in talking about this. It's really the topic is about philosophy. I'm getting some noise here. So it is about philosophy. And about the nature of the discipline itself. So philosophy is certainly abstract and speculative. Much of physics has its origins in speculative thinking. Pure physics is really a branch of applied mathematics, though based on so much that is established already that there are definitely inroads being made into the truth of it matter. But again, so just being speculative and abstract doesn't mean that something is simply directionless or speculative to the point that it's mere guesswork. So it's not susceptible to scientific proof, perhaps philosophy. It is a priori, as a term you see in the text. A priori means that something is prior to experience or prior to the kind of evidential world, though it can draw upon evidence and of course draw upon the world for its raw material. But it's not something we need to go out into the field and study things. Descartes did most of his philosophy tucked up in a blanket beside his stove, or lying in bed when he was living in Bohemia. So it's not evidential philosophy, but it isn't mere guesswork. And its philosophical positions are, or ought to be, in decent philosophy, philosophy that deserves the name, they're a product of argumentation, and philosophy is aimed at the truth. They're dealing with non-physical objects and non-perceptual objects very often, but mathematics does the same. So just because something is non-scientific doesn't mean it isn't worthy of pursuit. And again, the critical aspect of philosophy, the argumentative aspect, is important, as is the notion that it's aimed towards the truth and towards finding specifically philosophical truths, which are these very general truths, answers to very general questions about the nature of the world around us. And So I'm not going to dwell too much longer on this simply because it's going to draw us out of our time for the other topics, because again it has been dealt with in the first 2 lectures. So I'm given the sort of brief time we have for this. Yes, given the brief time we have for this lecture, I'm going to sort of zoom along, but I will give you some information on the reading room up in the meeting room. I'll give you a sort of few general notes of things to remember if you don't sort of catch it when I'm rushing through this material. So, to talk about the pre-Socratics, and these are again philosophers who were before Socrates. Of course, some of them were actually Socrates' contemporaries, but in a way they're called pre-Socratics because they're prior to Socrates' philosophical interest as much as anything else, and that, as Plato himself said, Socrates had very little interest in the sort of material makeup of the world, very little interest in physics, or in kind of try to revise the world view of the Homeric gods and the like. He was interested in being virtuous and having a virtuous society and teaching people how to be virtuous. This is pre-Socratic in the sense that these were scientists. That their interests are prior to Socrates in nature. There are some dealings with ethics, but they're not specifically ethical or political in nature as Socrates' are. So the major theme that we find in the pre-Socratics is the notion of the distinction between appearance and reality. What you have in Heraclitus, for instance, is the distinction between the world as it appears and how it really is. So the world appears to have these opposite features everywhere and to be in a state of flux, and yet it hangs together in some sort of apparent order. And what Heraclitus looked for was a logos, which is this account. Logos means several things in Greek. It means word, it means account, and some sort of, it might be, in Heraclitus, it's a kind of fundamental or foundational principle. So in Heraclitus, typically, and even in the text, in the Priory's text, Paul O'Grady focuses, and the author focuses on the aspect of flux in Heraclitus, as that's kind of his real thinking, that the world around us is constantly changing and is in a state of flux. He does, of course, believe this, but he also believes that the flux manifests itself in these opposites occurring all the time. But what then is the logos? The logos appears to be, in Heraclitus, the fact that the world hangs together, that these opposites are united by the logos. So you have oppositions being united. And this is the beginning of what you might call a metaphysics. It's a kind of a simple, or not primitive, but a beginning of a metaphysical way of looking at things. Again, as Wilfrid Sellars defined metaphysics, it's a description of how the world, in the most general sense, hangs together in the most general sense. That's definitely what Heraclitus is doing here, so it's a kind of metaphysics going on. Incidentally, the most famous quotation of Heraclitus, which comes from, was quoted by Plato, we cannot step on the same river twice. This is almost certainly not actually authentic, because there's another source for one that makes more sense according to the rest of Heraclitus' thinking, and that is that when we step in the same river, ever different waters flow. And that means, in order for the river to be the same, the water must constantly change. That's what rivers are. I've put some of Heraclitus' kind of most important little fragments, as they're called, the quotations that we've gleaned from other philosophers' works. I've put them up on the meeting room for you to have a look at if you're doing this essay, or just in general. They're interesting. What you have in Parmenides is an even more extreme picture of the distinction between appearance and reality. Through a very simple set of argumentation, Parmenides takes us from the world we're looking at to a radical conclusion about the nature of reality itself. And he starts out with, asking about being. So being is conceivable, you can think about it. Non-being is inconceivable, it's not something we can have a thought about. So we can start at this, very simple starting point. Again, another starting point he has is being is, non-being is not. Okay, quite clear. And he moves from these reasonable starting points into a radical conclusion that says that change is impossible, movement is impossible, diversity, meaning that there are different things, is an impossibility. It turns out that being is one complete, unitary something, without distinction, without change, without parts. Radical things. So all of reality is an absolute illusion, or rather all of our perceived reality. It's unreal. It's not reality at all. All of the things that we perceive, everything is illusion, and reality itself is unchanging. So this is an instance, really an early instance of Parmenides being persuaded by the beauty of this argument. He distinguished the world of truth, which is this being, this kind of unchanging, undivided, indivisible being, from the world of seeming. So he distinguishes truth from seeming. Movement is an illusion, change is an illusion, motion, because motion, for something to move through space, motion requires a void, and a void is nothingness, and nothingness isn't real. So this is the most radical distinction you can get between appearance and reality. To say the least, it's a very odd view. If you want to understand this well, the best piece of notes that I've seen is, I've put a link up online. It's Mark Cohen's notes, and it's part 2 of Parmenides, and he kind of goes through it in only a few pages. It's really, it's not a long, doesn't take a long time to go through, but it's worthwhile chugging through it. So, and it was really, his starting point was like a lot of the pre-Socratics. His starting point, the Parmenides, in looking at this, was to try and give an account of change. How one thing can change into another, how motion is possible. This is what Aristotle called physics, the study of motion and change, roughly still. That and the sort of material composition of the world. Now you've got what is studied by modern physics. So it was really in Parmenides that you find the first person really to go into detailed philosophical argument. Before this, you have philosophical opinions, speculations, and some reasons given for believing the things that they believed. About Anaximander and Anaximenes, and about the apeiron, the formless and the like. These are presented in kind of argumentative form, but in terms of something being kind of a beginning to end logical argument and a kind of a formal argumentation, Parmenides is really the earliest to have this type of formal argument. And of course, the conclusions are fairly, what you might think is fairly out there. It is unusual to come to this type of conclusion. But what was interesting about the philosophers of this period is that they didn't just say, well, obviously change is real, obviously motion is possible, obviously there are distinct objects in the world, time is real. Clearly the argument is nonsense, and just move on. So we can all see the arguments a bit, if we're not convinced by it, then there must be something wrong with it, otherwise we'd be convinced. But it's difficult to see exactly what's wrong with it. And that's what was interesting about the pre-Socratics as well. They actually engaged in the argument and tried to figure out what exactly is wrong with this. So very often, and even in the Priory text and Paul's text, it's mentioned that Plato was sort of the coming together of two distinct strands, or in fact coming in between Heraclitus' view that the world is in a state of constant flux, and Parmenides' view that the world is absolutely static. And so it's an interesting way of explaining it. Of course, flux isn't all of the answer for, it's not the whole theory of Heraclitus. The logos is really the important thing. This unification of opposites with this account, the logos, which explains how the world hangs together as a unity of opposites all over the place. And you can see when you just read a few of his fragments, that's the main thing, not just constant flux. It was his student, indeed, Cratylus, who is the teacher of Plato, who he said you can't even step in the same river once. His entire thinking was flux and that the world is unintelligible. So it's more likely, and it's quite likely that the opinion that Plato had of Heraclitus as being a philosopher of flux, rather than emphasizing the logos and the unity of opposites, came from Heraclitus' student Cratylus, and so we perhaps can't blame Plato for this misunderstanding. You get these things in Heraclitus, like the salt water is poisonous for man, but it's home for a fish. Opposite these things, it's not a contradiction that it's these two things. It's actually the account shows how it hangs together. So, in some of the earlier philosophers, of course, Thales, his notion of the distinction between appearance and reality is that in reality we have all of these different myriad of objects and types of things. Fundamentally, the fundamental principle, aperion, is Paul O'Grady always says in the text. He doesn't translate it. It means principle or origin, and it's the kind of fundamental making up the universe. People tend not to like the word origin because it gives a kind of a temporal attitude that somehow it's the beginning of something backwards in time, and that's not what really is. So it's really the fundamental stuff. It's the fundamental makeup of something is what you have when we're talking about that. So Thales thought it was water, and when you get or it could be the aperion, this formless thing that Anaximander believed it was, and you have a world account based upon this world, how all of these different forms of that we perceive is actually explained in a more fundamental sense. So it could be either the four elements of earth, air, fire, water, could indeed be the modern periodic table with hundreds of different elements. That's the same thing going on. We have all of the things accounted for, all of these different colours and things are fundamentally constituted by something else, something at a more fundamental level. And in Anaximander, he believed that the aperion, the indefinite or boundless, is called, is more fundamental. So he believed that it couldn't be one of the elements, couldn't be the fundamental element if there were four elements, say, or any other set of elements you might. One of them can't be fundamental because it would come to dominate all of the others. If one of them was more real, if water were more real, were fundamental, and everything else was constructed out of water, if like Thales said, he thought water would come to dominate because there'd be no reason for it not to. So he thought that in order for there to be all of this wide range of experiential things, all of this stuff that we can sense, different types of objects, wood and brass and stone and flesh. In order for that to be possible, and for this kind of myriad of different forms or different forms, but qualities to exist in the world, then the fundamental nature, the fundamental stuff, must be what he called aperion, indefinite or boundless. And so it's a kind of it's itself a kind of a formless thing. He was incidentally he because they liked speculation. He also believed that the shape of the world was sort of like a tin of beans, the flat top, and we lived on the top. So they had, and again, even the aperion, that is quite speculative. I mean, completely speculative. But again, there's reasoning involved in trying to come to this conclusion. There's an element of guesswork in it, but he thinks there's a better reason for believing this than believing, Thales' position, for instance. So it isn't ordinary guesswork, but you can see the importance when we were talking about the essay was asking about the kind of importance of the pre-Socratics in the history of philosophy. It is really the questions they are asking rather than strictly their conclusions. So the questions themselves are important. This is not to say, as sometimes people say, even Russell sometimes perhaps phrases it poorly, and they say the questions are more important than any answers. Only in a particular way. This is important. So the questions are important simply because we want to find out the answers. From our point of view, you don't really get anyone supporting any of the pre-Socratic positions now. The pre-Socratic views are well and truly out of date. They've been superseded. So it's not that there are any schools of pre-Socratic thinking now. So it is, in the sense, the questions they ask that are the questions that we still ask and that physicists ask. Of course, the pre-Socratics are as much physicists as they are philosophers, and speculative scientists though they be. But they wanted to find out the truth. So the questions on their own are fine. If you can't answer them, then the questions aren't that important, or perhaps we're just in a sort of a mire of ignorance. It's not good. So it's only in a particular sense that the questions are more important than the answers. The thing is, they wanted to use reasoning to find out answers to these questions. That's the important bit, not the questions on their own, but some idea that you have a means and a method of getting to the questions. Xenophanes was one of the very interesting pre-Socratics, Xenophanes with an X. And Xenophanes was highly skeptical of the Homeric gods. He thought that they just behaved like, like most of the Middle Eastern gods, pretty much like a petulant king, just constantly annoyed, constantly smiting people, and with very little to recommend them. And he thought they acted so much like Greek warriors that he said that if horses had gods, they'd have 4 hooves and a long face. He thought they were clearly made in the image of not just an image of man, but a rather annoying king who needs constant validation, or will go crazy, sort of Donald Trump types. Xenophanes also, you can sort of have a look at his theories. I've got some links up. But he also had an interesting thing, and that he thought that knowledge was difficult to acquire. Again, it doesn't look like a large leap. But he thought that some things we can know very easily without too much inquiry. Some things we can know through somebody teaching us, or through kind of testimony and observation. Some other things might be a great deal more difficult to know about. And some things may indeed be impossible for us to know. But the notion that there might be limits to our knowledge, or that knowledge itself is difficult to acquire, again, this is looks perfectly obvious to us. It wasn't at all obvious to the Greeks. Again, this is in what they started with was a world where the religious authorities told you what to believe, which is all very well, except when you realise that the religious authorities have no reason for believing any of this stuff is true itself. That we have our own mental capacities, and we can inquire ourselves. So that's one of the other things, as well as the new types of questions they were asking, is that this sort of democratization of knowledge, that there's no reason at all why any of us can't ask these questions. Same as Socrates did in the moral realm. There's no reason why we can't ask a judge, what qualifies you to be a judge? Do you know what justice really is? The pre-Socratics asked this about the physical world. They thought they'd bring it upon themselves to inquire into the nature of change, the nature of matter, the fundamental constitution of the universe, what things are made of, the origin of the universe, the origin of human life, the origin of all life. There's a fascinating array of different things. One thing I will mention briefly, it isn't really mentioned in the text very much, but I have some links. They're easy to understand, and do read them. It's a very interesting school from the pre-Socratics called the atomists. People believed in atoms, and they had a very unusual response to Parmenides, his extreme position that there's no movement and no change. And again, he got to that position by saying, what is, what isn't, isn't. And the atomists said, what do we do with this? So the notion and the conclusion for Parmenides is we can't generate something. Nothing can be made, because it would have to be made from what is not. Nothing can become nothing, because nothing can change, because that would for something to become not a house, it would have to become non-being. And the arguments of the atomists started out very simply saying, we agree with on one point with Parmenides, what is, but contrary to Parmenides, they believed what is not is as well. You have two types of things: tiny atoms, beings, and non-being, void, empty space. And they could have they construct the entire world with beings, atoms, and void, nothingness or empty space. And so all objects are the composition of tiny atoms, all clumped together in space, with lots of spaces between them. And atoms grip together in different ways, they have different shapes. So you have still this very big gap between experience and appearance and reality. The things like colours, smells, tastes, all of these things don't exist on the fundamental level. What exists in the fundamental level are atoms and space. Atoms themselves aren't visible, they're invisible, they're too small to see, they're colourless, they're indestructible, and atoms and void together in various arrangements mean that we can perceive things. So appearance is still on our side, but of course it's real enough. So it's a very it's purely speculative, and a lot of the time completely correct. So you have Democritus was just looking at bright sunlight. Like anytime you see bright sunlight, he perceived a little piece of dust getting flicked around, a little hair or something. And he thought, that's getting flicked around by small invisible particles pushing it. This is true. Democritus asked, how is it that we smell bread? He said, it's simple. When I walk past a bakery, tiny particles, tiny atoms of the bread, these bread molecules, all clumped together, pass through the void, go up my nose, and touch the surface of my brain. It turns out that's what happens. And why do we smell bread here and not something else? He said, well, simple bread has a different shaped clump of atoms, and anything with that shape will smell like bread. That's true. This is why bitter almonds smells like cyanide, and vice versa. They have the same shape, though they've got different constituents. So, fundamentally these were highly interesting, highly speculative, but really, really rather brilliant thinkers. So, Colours, textures, taste, smells, all of these are caused by combinations of atoms and void. And of course, because the atomists were materialists, they believed that there's nothing but matter and void. They also believed that the soul, the gods, absolutely everything is made up of atoms. So the pre-Socratics are, again, there's a minefield of wonderful things, and actually not a minefield, but a field that's ripe for harvesting of wonderful thinking. You know, you don't need to mention them all, there's not space, but don't, again, a general thing in writing essays, when they say the pre-Socratics, we don't mean one or two, but you need to give a, you know, you can leave a few out. But the important ones need to be discussed, and several need to be discussed. It's likewise it's general advice for philosophical essays, as with every other essay. Don't take a radical interpretation of the essay title. For instance, in saying what are the main themes in Plato's Republic, you shouldn't at the very beginning say, well, there's not enough space to discuss many themes, so I'm only going to discuss justice. Not an answer to the question, I'm afraid. Of course, hundreds of books have been written about different themes in it, but you're asked about the themes, so stick to the wording of the question. Right, we'll move on to Socrates, and Socrates, his need for definitions in his inquiry. So, what is Socratic inquiry, and why did Socrates require definitions? So this is it's sort of interesting. Right at the beginning of the Republic is Plato's work, so I must make that clear. Actually, it's sort of mentioned in the text, but the early texts of Plato are really they are Socratic in the sense that they're probably, if not actually Socrates' words, they're definitely his method of doing philosophy, and probably a lot of his views, even if they don't represent real dialogues. They probably don't. But the early dialogues are Socratic dialogues. Typically, they arrive at no definite conclusion, though again they have advanced the inquiry by striking down various purported definitions or attempted definitions of important moral terms, goodness or piety or justice or the like. So the very first book or two books of the Republic is sort of Socratic in nature, but the Republic is not Socrates' work. This is Plato's mature work. So when we're looking at Socrates, we look at the early dialogues, the Socratic dialogues, Euthyphro, Meno, these kinds of dialogues. And then the middle and late dialogues are Phaedo, Republic, and so on. But the same thing happens when at the Socratic dialogue at the beginning of Republic is, of course, asking about justice and asking people who ought to know what justice really is. And they try to give definitions or the like, and they fail. How Socratic dialogue works is not that Socrates stands and just simply disagrees with you. Is Socrates draws out, he says, he draws people through his questioning. And indeed he draws them into the position where their own definition of a term like justice will end up contradicting their own beliefs. So it'll be shown to be internally inconsistent, to be contradictory, that is. And of course contradictions are false, so he must be wrong. Something's gone wrong if you're believing a contradiction. So if we ask what is piety, what is beauty, what is love, Socrates wanted a definition of these things. When people attempted a definition, he will say, well, according to your definition, here's what follows. And it's something they don't want to follow. So a good definition, again, do look at, I'm going to put an article up before the weekend on Socratic definitions. Mark Cohen's notes have just a few pages. Definitely read this. Even if you're not doing the essay, read it. It's very, very good and very clear on Socratic definitions and kind of their purpose. So what you want in a good definition is that everything that falls under the definition should fall under it. So it's not too broad. The definition of justice, say, is not so broad as to include instances of injustice. We don't want that. That'd be too broad a definition. The definition must not be too narrow, or else it will exclude instances of justice. So the definition must capture perfectly all just things, people, events. We need a definition of this sort. Likewise for all of the other kind of important terms. Why was he interested in definitions? This is the real important bit in Socrates. Socrates believed that we need definitions in order to act justly, or to act well. In order to be good, we need to have a definition of good. In order to act justly, we need to have a correct definition of justice. This, again, you need to sort of have a little bit of charity with Plato's thoughts here. It's difficult to grasp. It seems implausible, I should say, rather than being difficult to grasp. It seems implausible initially, but I'll try and convince you why it shouldn't be. Right. So, according to Socrates, any time I do anything, I do it because I think it's the right thing to do. Plato captured this later on by saying that we always act towards the good. Really, what he meant there is that we always act with some good in mind. Everything we do is to achieve something that we believe to be a good thing. If I go, if I drink a glass of water because I want water, water is a good thing. If I see tea and Jaffa cakes and I go for that, it's because I see some good in this pursuit of tea and Jaffa cakes. And this goes for everything. So on Socrates' view, his psychology, if you like, his sort of moral psychology, he believed that we always act in such a way as we think what we're doing is right. And if we're actually immoral, if we're acting immorally, it's because of ignorance. We simply have the wrong notion of what goodness is, the wrong notion of what justice is, or the wrong notion of what love is, any of these important moral kind of concepts. To go back to the example, actually, it's still it might be a remnant of a Socratic dialogue, but in the beginning of the Republic, where Socrates asks, what is the definition of justice, and the reply comes, it's returning what's borrowed. I think, well, that's that can be. I can think of certainly of instances where returning what's borrowed is what is just. But what, for instance, if you've your friend has lent you a knife and in the meantime gone insane, is returning the knife to someone who's gone insane an act of justice? No, it seems to be unjust. Bad things will happen or might happen. Therefore, justice does not consist in, by definition, returning what's borrowed. Of course, again, this is Platonic, and there's no notion of forms or anything like in Socrates. Socrates' thinking. But the notion is, I always act according to what I think is correct, and somehow a definition of justice, even a bad one in my head, it works as a template. When I have a definition in my head of justice, and I act unjustly, it's because the definition is incorrect, and it compels me to act in a way that I think is correct, because it coheres with my notion of justice, but is actually wrong. If I convince myself in the sort of say Boris Johnson notion that radical inequality is the major driving force in an economy, and so I should persecute the poor. It's simply because, on Socrates' view, he has an inadequate definition of justice. He's got a false definition, and this is what makes him act then according to the definition, will act immorally. So if you think, in this instance, they're like a template of how to act. Definitions are a template according to which we act and behave. If we knew what justice really was, that's what the definition of justice was, then we would not act unjustly. In fact, we could not act unjustly if we had the correct definition. Would act according to how we believe, and would believe correctly. So it's a template. So this seems implausible for a few reasons. One of them is that it looks as though people can be in full knowledge and yet behave badly. And this is what's called, we see it in the text later on when discussing Aristotle, it's called akrasia. In English it's usually called weakness of will, or weakness of the will. And weakness of will means, we can see perfect instances with drug addicts. They know that they shouldn't take drugs, they know that the drugs will destroy their lives or kill them, and yet they see something good in taking drugs now. Very short-term good, which is overwhelmed by all the other goods of not taking drugs, but somehow, despite the fact that they're in full knowledge that they're doing something that's contrary to their own good, they choose a lesser good, much lesser good, short-term good perhaps of some relief or whatever. And this is what weakness of the will is. According to Socrates, weakness of the will is impossible. It's not something that that can happen. Simply, we act according to what we think is good. So it's what you might call a naive ethical or moral psychology. It's not, I don't think, obviously foolish, and you can sort of understand that there's something correct in what he says, that if we were in full possession of what justice really was, then we could act justly. Plato's got a more subtle position on this. Aristotle better again. So that's really the reason that he wanted definitions, which was because of his moral psychology. And again, he drew the answers out of people. He didn't sort of go around the place lecturing people. He asked them questions, and then they would, through their own reasoning, show themselves that that what they thought was the correct definition of justice or piety or the like actually was incorrect. And what we see in Plato is typically the dialogue ends on aporia. Aporia is this kind of philosophical, higher level of philosophical puzzlement. It's the starting point of a lot of dialogues, and it ends up with this aporia, this lack of conclusion. The one instance where it doesn't end in an aporia is in the Euthyphro dilemma, which is mentioned in the text. It's important to consider if you're writing this essay, to mention. In this, he asks whether the pious, talking about the pious, we might discuss it, the same question that is asked about the good. Is the pious pious because it is loved by the gods, or is it loved by the gods because it is pious? The same question is asked in later in Christianity. Is something good because it's approved of by God, or is it approved of by God because it is good? Socrates comes to a definite answer. The pious is approved of by the gods because it is pious. That is prior. It's not because of the will of the gods or anything to do with the gods' choice or anything else. The gods approve of what is pious or what is good simply because it is independent of them what is good or what is pious. So this is one of the instances where he's actually come to a definite conclusion. And again, Socrates described himself as a gadfly, as somebody who goes around the place irritating people, and of course he did indeed irritate quite a few people in going around Athens and asking questions, because it is dangerous at the best of times to criticize public figures or politicians. But what he showed simply by asking questions was that if a judge doesn't know what justice is, he can't act justly. and therefore is unfit for his job. And Socrates was accused of corrupting the youth, not for his sort of unorthodox religious ideas or the belief that he had a personal voice, or the voice of God. It was because the youth can mimic Socrates in asking questions like, why should I obey a judge if the judge doesn't know what justice is? The same can be asked now. If a judge gives an incorrect judgment, why should I obey him? Why should I obey a law if I think the law is made by people who are not up to the job? They don't know what a fair society is. And it's this is why Socrates was ultimately put to death. Is that in the best of it's always dangerous to show the people in the ruling class that they're a bunch of morons that aren't up to the job. Of course, in Ireland they've given us a bit of a head start. So we can see, yes, I'll have to move on now because of the time, but you can see the important thing there is Socrates also his mother was a midwife, and he said he was sort of a midwife of ideas. He didn't go around trying to blast people with rhetoric or ideas. He asked them questions about what they believed, and then asked more questions and more questions, and when they didn't reach a conclusion, they at least knew what he knew to begin with, that he didn't know, was what the oracle at Delphi said. He was the wisest man in Athens, and he thought, this can't be right because I don't know anything. But he realised that he knew one fact that the others didn't. They believed that they knew things they didn't know, whereas he was aware that he didn't know them, so that made him more wise. So, yes, I'll have to move on from there, but you can see there's quite a bit of material there, and really it's the reasoning behind him having this demand for definition is indeed his moral psychology, this idea that there can't be weakness of the will. And if you put it in this way, all moral failure is fundamentally an epistemic failure. It's a failure in knowledge. Every time someone acts immorally, it's because of a lack of knowledge. And this is why he's got this focus on definitions. Again, if you don't grasp that, then you won't get the why is the focus on definitions. So we'll move on to Plato's Republic, and I'm going to put a few notes on this so just I don't miss anything when I'm skipping through this. So the central point of Plato's Republic, of course, as you can sort of tell in the title, it's about justice and the state. It's what makes a state just. And indeed, in his estimation, he ends up asking two questions. What is it for a human being to be just, and what is it for a state to be just? What makes a state just? And the accounts are mirrors of each other. The just state is one where there are three parts of society, and the rational part, if you like, of society it runs the society. So you have the guardians, are the philosopher kings. The auxiliaries are the sort of the army, the police force, and then the workers are the people who produce everything for the state. And they're in three separate branches within society, and the society is just when the guardians are in charge. In the side of the soul, you have the intellective, the sort of intelligible part of the soul, the rational part of the soul, the spirited part of the soul, which is desire, and then the spirited part corresponds with the soldiers, and the appetitive part is the sort of desire part of the soul. If desire were to govern the soul, you'll have someone who's not rational, who won't act morally, and likewise with the spirited part being in charge, this person will be overly aggressive and will neglect the rational part, won't act morally. So the just person will be governed by reason. Reason will govern the other two parts of the soul. Incidentally, these aren't sort of figurative. These are genuinely, the soul isn't three parts in his notion. It's a tripartite soul, not separable, but they are distinct. And this is mirrored in society by the three parts of society. So there's a link here between the political side and the ethical. What makes a just person is a person that's governed by reasoning, and what makes a just society is a society that's governed by people who know what justice really is, and these are the philosophers. So there's a sort of a caricature of Plato and talking about the philosopher kings, that he wants himself and his buddies to go and take over society and govern everyone else, kind of a tyranny of some sort, or kind of fascism. It's easy to fall into this. Don't let yourself, because it's not justifiable. So ask yourself this question, sort of for comprehension. Imagine that someone, why is it that the guardians should rule society? Simple. The guardians know the forms. They're the philosophers. So the philosophers know forms, and in order to know, this is again not Socrates but Plato's view, in order to know what justice really is, you need to know the form of justice. You need to know what justice is in itself, and that is knowledge of a form. So how do I learn to know the forms? Go through the philosophical education, and you can grasp what forms really are. That makes you a philosopher, a lover of wisdom, and a lover of the forms. The people who try to give accounts of everything by just appealing to the things around us, as we'll talk about in just a little second, are lovers of sights and sounds, according to Plato, not lovers of the forms. And we'll see why that can't be real knowledge in a little while. So let's imagine that someone who wasn't a philosopher managed to know what justice really was. They became acquainted with the form of justice. Would this person be allowed to govern in Plato's Republic? So you can see this is really a trick question. A non-philosopher knowing the forms is a contradiction in terms. What makes someone a philosopher, on Plato's view, is knowledge of the forms. So if you know what the form of justice is, no matter who you are, you're a philosopher. You know the forms, and therefore you're qualified to rule, because you know what it is for their society to be just. That's what makes you a philosopher. You know the form of justice, and so the notion that it's a sort of quasi, a dictatorial society is not true. Simply, he had the radical position that in order to have a just society, you should have people who know what a just society is running the society. It's not. It's pretty radical these days, but perhaps it needs looking into again. On the political side, of course, there are sets of other kind of things in Plato's Republic. There are quite a bit of revisionary thinking, and it's some people have thought, since society looks so strange, that maybe it's just all an allegory for the soul. I think that's unlikely, because otherwise he wouldn't mention such things as the capacities that people have to have particular positions, or in fact the equality of women in intellect. Plato, of course, it's relatively fair to say that he's an early advocate for equality of rights for women. He thought that the only things that women were not as good at as men at were things that involved the various men having greater strength, greater physical strength. So he thought there should be women guardians, that there's no problem at all in this. In fact, elsewhere Plato said that in terms of sort of morality or rationality, really, as much as anything else, women are at an advantage over men, because men are governed too much by rage, by anger, which makes them irrational. So he thought that men are more prone to irrationality because of anger. So he's got relatively radical views. There's also, of course, you have themes of a radically revised society where the nuclear families are dispersed and you've got a kind of a communal upbringing, and all children are sort of brought up in commune by everyone. You end up with a sort of an uncomfortable society in this respect as well, because you end up with eugenics, that sort of particular persons are permitted to breed. Very odd. But at the same time, you had a notion in his, and again this was never a society that would ever have been tried or worked, but his notion was that everyone, whether you're an auxiliary, a soldier, or a trader, or a farmer, or guardian, or whatever, everyone will have the same education up to the age of 18, and that men and women included, and this includes mathematics, astronomy, all the things that are necessary for a kind of good education on Plato's view. So men and women being identical in their kind of mental capacities means that women would be perfectly good, and women would indeed in his society would be rulers. So the subordinate parts of the soul, of course, are still important, and so are the subordinate parts of society. They don't become unimportant because they're governed by the rational people. They're still centrally important. And again, the society itself is not one that's some sort of monarchy either. It isn't that he had a notion as allegory of metals in the soul, that people have got different types of say copper or silver or gold, that they've got these natural dispositions, kind of natural inbuilt abilities, and that these will be, some people will be more suited to being trained up as philosophers and trained up in justice, and others will be more suited to different roles based upon the fundamental kind of abilities that they have, these metals in the soul. He didn't think that it was hereditary. He didn't think that the children of guardians will be, definitely be guardians, or that children of farmers will be farmers. This wasn't it at all. It was the dispositions they had, the natural abilities would then be fostered by society. There's no reason at all why the children of blacksmiths or astronomers or soldiers wouldn't be guardians. It's all down to the natural abilities being brought out. So when you get when it comes to the person of the soul, when the rational part dominates the soul, when the rational part is in charge of the other two parts, then you end up having rational appetites and rational spirited part. The whole person is rendered rational and rendered just as a consequence. So there are some things that worried Plato a little bit, that I'll mention briefly. One of them is art. He didn't particularly like art, and that's because in part because of his theory of the forms. And so I'll mention the theory of the forms briefly. In the essay itself, you probably won't go into too much detail, though they do need to be mentioned. Plato thought that he really did believe that the world around was in a state of flux, that it displays opposite features all the time. When something is beautiful, in some sense it's ugly. When something is big, it's in some sense small. Two things that are equal will be unequal to a third thing, or they won't always be equal. One of them might break. Things change. Things come into being and die. They change too much. Effectively, the world is too full of oppositions and change to be knowable in itself. For something to be knowable, it needs to be static and fixed. Not to say that it's a Parmenidean world, because there are many forms. So the forms exist outside space and time. They are changeless, and they're the objects of thought. The objects around us, the objects of perception, can be at most objects of opinion. So he thought when we have knowledge of something, we really have knowledge of the forms itself, and we get this knowledge of the forms through recollection. So if you think of, if we have this is always better with a live audience, but let's imagine you guess what this object is. Hopefully you guessed it's a circle. And of course, this example's from Noam Chomsky actually. Of course, if you look at it, it's not a circle, it's an irregular figure. But for some reason, we're inclined to say that's a poorly drawn circle, rather than a perfectly well drawn irregular figure. It turns out we've never actually experienced a circle. We can't experience a circle through the senses. We can't experience equality. Equality isn't an object of the senses. It's an intellectual object, and it's something we can't have got through the senses. Beauty isn't something that can be grasped through the senses. And so you have a problem there. We do have ideas of something being more and less beautiful, yet we can't say that beauty is an object of any of the senses. If you were to ask, what makes the sunset beautiful? And someone were to reply, the colours. Well, if I take those same colours and paint your living room with them, they will make the living room very garish indeed. And you say, well, what makes this living room ugly? The colours. So the same things are responsible for something being ugly and it being beautiful. That means the person who tries to limit their explanations to the physical world, to the things that we sense, is coming up short. These things can't be the objects of knowledge. So this is what Plato called the lovers. These people are called the lovers of sights and sounds. The people who limit their explanations to the sensible world, to the things that we can sense. It turns out, on Plato's account, we actually have this knowledge through the forms, and we get this through recollection. So that somehow through contemplation and recollection of things in this world, we remember the forms from a previous existence. So things like circularity, we have all got a perfectly good grasp of circularity, yet we've never experienced a true circle. It's always a little bit off, but we have an idea of it. And likewise with true equality and the like. So, on Plato there are two worlds. There's the absolutely real world of forms, and we can come to know forms through recollection of a previous life. And there's the world of the things around us, the world of flux, for want of a better term, the world of sights and sounds and smells. These things have their natures because they participate in the forms. They're poor imitations of the forms, if you like. And so, as Anthony Kenny said, the form of dog is the dog, the whole dog, and nothing but the dog. The form of beautiful is itself beautiful. The form of justice is itself just. The form of man is itself man. All of these things, actually, all of the things around us have their natures because of participation in the forms, and in this participation he means here the really mimicking it, that the objects around us resemble in these small senses the forms. So a brown dog will participate in different forms. It can account for things changing while the objects of knowledge remain the same. And of course it's knowledge of the forms that makes it that the guardians are fit rulers. And so why does Plato have it in for art? Well, there's a sort of in modern art there's a similar type of kind of primitive Platonism going on. People think that representative art, that when people, what's the point of copying real things? That's not art. Well, Plato thought, this is sort of a primitive way of looking at things. Plato thought, given that the things around us in this world are copies, mere imperfect copies of the forms, what's the point in making a copy of the forms? He thought it's supremely pointless. When it came to poetry, he thought that poetry was doing something similar, but also making things up. So in the allegory of the cave, which you might mention in your essay, it's not an allegory about education, it's an allegory about our ignorance, that we're stuck in the cave, not looking at the puppets, not looking at the objects around us, but looking at the shadows. And this, I think, might be a reference to politics, where the people are not just looking at the objects of sight, the things of sensation, the objects of sensation or of perception. They're looking more particularly at illusions when we're talking about politics. And he thought this about rhetoric and poetry, that in fact it's not just that people are getting they're trying to find knowledge from the things around us in the world, which are inadequate of knowledge, but they're being persuaded of things that aren't real at all. So that they're actually dealing not just in the objects of sight and sound, if you like, or the objects of sensation, but they're dealing in pure illusion. And this is why you have an unjust society. So he didn't like art and poetry for this reason. He thought that poetry that makes people happy over something that isn't real, or sad over something that isn't real, is a bad idea. He'd have poetry banned. Aristotle, on the other hand, thought it brought catharsis, this kind of a liberating emotion that was kind of artificially generated by a fictional thing. Why didn't he like rhetoric? Rhetoric was the sort of the trade of the sophists, and you can see one of the things in rhetoric is you can persuade people of something not by how good the argument is in logical form, but by the beauty of the argument, by how it's presented. And of course you have expert rhetoricians. Martin Luther King was a good rhetorician. Bertrand Russell was very good at rhetorician. It's not that they said anything particularly complicated sometimes, but they said it in such a beautiful way that it sort of persuaded people. Plato is worried that it's because of the beauty, the beauty of how it's being presented, that people believe it, and he doesn't like this. Hitler was very good at speeches. That's a bad thing. People were persuaded of something false by somehow the power of rhetoric. Ireland, thankfully, is not over-endowed with politicians with a gift for rhetoric. But and again, in America, they don't seem to need it. They can just simply babble nonsense, and people will believe anyway. But you can see that. So his idea with rhetoric was that it will not lead us, even if it leads us towards the truth, it won't lead us for the right reasons. Aristotle, on the other hand, thought that rhetoric was fine. He thought that it's an instrument of persuasion towards the truth. It needn't be pernicious. Socrates, or rather Plato, in this period, was worried that it would mislead. Right, I should better leave it there, and we'll join you with a cup of coffee for the following tutorial. I'm going to put a batch of notes up because again this is a slightly short lecture. I'm going to put a bit of notes online of my own stuff and a few maybe an article I think on Socrates, and just so we can make sure there are any points that I might have dealt with too briefly or even skipped. I'll have them up there for you to have a look at. Okay, thank you.